Most of the times I've gone hiking at night, the scariest part has never been what I see. It's what I hear. The way the woods seem to change when the sun drops, when your only vision is the pale, shaky beam of a headlamp cutting through darkness. You can walk the same trail in daylight and feel safe, but at night every sound out of place makes your body stiffen and your thoughts race. I've had more than one moment where I stopped cold because of branches snapping just out of reach of my light, or the sound of leaves shifting when there was no wind. You want to tell yourself it's just deer, maybe a raccoon, but the noise always feels heavier than that. There have been nights when I've been too tired to even check. I remember one time I woke up after dozing off by the fire, hearing steps in the brush, deliberate ones, close enough to raise the hairs on my arms. The exhaustion pressed down so hard that I didn't want to move, didn't want to shine my light, because part of me was scared of what I might actually see. I lay there listening, frozen, my heart pounding, telling myself it was nothing, probably just a small animal nosing around, maybe even one of us shifting in our bags. I didn't get up and I never knew what it was. That's what hiking at night does. It makes you question whether you even want the answers. But the night that sticks with me most happened after a late hike with a couple of friends. We'd gone out into the mountains, not too far from a large military base. The trails out there wound through pines and rugged slopes, scattered with boulders and the remains of old logging roads. It wasn't the kind of place you ran into people much, especially not at night. We liked it that way. The air was cool, the stars came out bright, and the silence was almost heavy enough to feel like another presence walking with us. We hadn't planned on staying out as late as we did. The trail was longer than we thought, and we got caught up in it, the kind of restless mood where you just keep going. By the time we looped back, it was deep into the night, maybe close to 2 in the morning. The forest felt emptier than usual then, as if even the animals had gone still. Our headlamps caught little more than the white flash of dust on rocks and the glint of tree bark. Every sound we made echoed in the silence. The crunch of gravel, the swish of our packs, the tired rhythm of our steps. When the parking area finally came into view, I remember feeling that small wave of relief you get when you see your car after a long hike. It was just a wide pull-off off the main dirt road, nothing but shadows of trees on all sides. My SUV was the only vehicle there, dust-coated from the long drive-in. But something about it looked wrong even from a distance. The surface of the car didn't catch the light the way I expected. It wasn't smooth. It was marked up, smudged in patches that spread across the hood and doors. At first I thought maybe condensation had formed in odd streaks, or maybe pine needles had brushed down, but when we got closer it was clear. The car was covered in prints. Not just a few random ones either, dozens of them. Hands, feet, even something that looked like the dragging of palms or claws through the dust. They weren't small. They were large enough to make me stop in my tracks, my mouth dry, spread across the hood, smeared up the windows, circling around the sides. Some were pressed so hard that they had pulled streaks of dirt as though whatever made them had leaned its weight into it. I bent close to the hood with my headlamp, my chest tight. The prints were too big to be children fooling around. Too human to be any animal I could name. Long fingers stretched out across the glass, wider than mine, dragged downward as if something had leaned over and pressed its weight onto the windshield. On the side panels, wide smudges trailed where something had scraped along, the dirt pushed aside in streaks. A few marks looked like feet, bare, but oversized, the toes dragging just enough to leave uneven lines. I tried to laugh at first, to tell myself it was just a trick. Maybe some locals from the base who came out here to mess with anyone parked overnight. The kind of thing bored people might do just to get a rise out of hikers. But the detail of it made my stomach twist. Whoever did it had taken their time. They had circled the vehicle, leaned on it, dragged their hands slow across the surface. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like they wanted whoever owned the car to come back and see it, to imagine what had stood there in the dark touching everything. The more I looked, the more unsettling it became. The prints overlapped but didn't seem rushed. They weren't sloppy. They almost looked arranged, placed with some kind of intention, the way they spread across the hood in pairs, the way some dragged down from the roof as though someone had crouched there. It wasn't just vandalism. It was too quiet, too exact. None of us spoke for a long while. We just circled the SUV with our lights, staring, not wanting to be the first to open a door. The forest around us seemed heavier than it had on the trail, every shadow stretching closer. It was the kind of fear that makes your skin crawl, the feeling that eyes might still be out there watching the way we reacted. Finally, I climbed in, my hands trembling on the keys. The engine roared to life, and the headlights swept across the pull-off, but they only showed more trees and more shadows. Nothing moved. The prints glowed faintly under the beams. The streaks of fingers dragged across glass and steel. The drive-out was silent. The road wound through the mountains, dust rising in the red glow of the taillights. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see something step out into the beam of light behind us. My chest didn't loosen until we finally hit pavement, the glow of distant town lights breaking through the trees. The next morning, in daylight, the prints were still there. They hadn't faded. Seeing them in the sun didn't make them less unsettling. It made them worse. They were real, not just tricks of the night. You could see the way the fingers spread, the uneven drag marks where skin or something rougher had pulled the dust. I never figured out who or what made them. Maybe it was just a few guys from the base playing a joke. But if it was, they went to lengths most people wouldn't bother with. They made it look wrong in a way that stayed with us. Not just like a prank, but like a message. Like we'd stumbled into something we weren't supposed to. Even now, years later, I think about that night when I hear snapping branches just out of sight or steps in the dark. Because the truth is, the scariest things aren't what you see in the woods. They're the things that leave signs, the things that make sure you know you weren't alone out there, even if you never catch them in the act. That SUV, covered in those oversized prints, was proof. Something or someone had been right there with us, moving around in the dark while we hiked under the stars. And they wanted us to know it. I've had plenty of close calls on trails before. Steep drop-offs, sudden storms, the occasional rattlesnake stretched across the path. But nothing has ever rattled me like the time I came close to getting between a mother bear and her cubs. Even now, when I think back to it, I feel the same kind of hollow fear in my chest. The kind that makes your stomach drop and your mind go sharp all at once. It was late spring, the time of year when the air is warm but the nights still hold a chill, and the forest feels alive again after winter. The trail I had picked that day was one I hadn't done before, a loop that cut through thick pine woods, followed a stream for a while, then climbed up to a ridgeline. The air smelled of damp soil and pine needles, and the ground was soft underfoot from recent rain. Everything about the morning felt good, like one of those hikes where you know you'll lose track of time just enjoying the quiet. The woods were calm. I heard birds calling back and forth, squirrels scrambling up trunks, and the steady sound of water whenever the trail got close to the stream. I wasn't pushing hard, just walking at a steady pace, letting myself relax. For the first couple of hours, I didn't see anyone else. It was just me, the trees, and the trail stretching out ahead. It happened in one of those moments when I wasn't really thinking, when I had let myself drift into the rhythm of hiking. I rounded a bend where the trail dropped into a shady hollow, and that's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just movement in the brush. Then the shapes became clear. Two small bears, their fur still fluffy, darker than the shadows around them, rolling and pawing at each other near the trail. Cubs. My heart lurched. They couldn't have been much bigger than medium-sized dogs, clumsy in the way young animals are. They tumbled around, one swatting at the other, then stopping to sniff at the ground. For a second, I just froze. I'd never been that close to bear cubs in the wild before. From the distance I stood, I could make out the softness of their coats and the awkward way their paws moved. And then the real weight of the situation hit me. Cubs meant a mother. And if I was seeing them here on the trail in front of me, then there was every chance she was close by. Maybe hidden in the brush above me, maybe down the slope, maybe already watching me. The danger of it landed in my chest like a stone. Everyone knows the rule. You never, ever get between a mother bear and her cubs. That's the nightmare scenario. She won't hesitate. She won't bluff. She'll do whatever it takes to protect them. And there isn't much you can do if she decides you're a threat. The air suddenly felt too still, like the forest was holding its breath. My skin prickled, and the sound of my heartbeat seemed louder than the birds or the stream. I knew I had to stay calm, had to avoid any sudden movement, but every nerve in my body screamed at me to back away. The cubs hadn't noticed me yet. They were too busy with each other, their small snorts and chuffs carrying softly in the hollow. That almost made it worse, because I knew that any second they might turn, see me, and bolt. And if they bolted, their mother would come crashing through the brush like a freight train. I scanned the trees, trying to pick out any movement, any dark shape that didn't belong. The shadows seemed endless. Every stump and cluster of leaves looked like it could hide something. My hand hovered near the strap of my pack where my bear spray was clipped, but even that felt risky. A sudden reach could look like aggression. The cubs shuffled closer to the trail, and my stomach twisted. If they stepped onto the path, I'd be right in their line, and if their mother was uphill, she would see me as standing between her and her babies. The thought of it made my throat dry. I forced myself to take one slow step back, then another. Each step felt loud even though I was barely making a sound. My boots pressed into the soft soil, and I moved with exaggerated care, trying not to snap a twig or crunch a leaf. My breathing came shallow, controlled, like I was afraid even that could betray me. The cubs kept tumbling, oblivious, but every second I stayed felt like pushing my luck further. I could almost feel her eyes on me, somewhere unseen, deciding whether I was harmless or whether I needed to be driven off. That not knowing, whether she was behind a tree 10 feet away or 100 yards off, was what terrified me most. After what felt like forever, the cubs finally moved off the trail, vanishing into thick brush down the slope. Relief hit me in a rush, but it didn't last, because if they had gone down there, that was probably where she was waiting. My chest tightened. I realized I'd been holding my shoulders tense for so long that they ached. I didn't waste time. I kept backing up, slowly at first, then turning once I felt enough distance between us. My legs wanted to run, but I knew better. I walked fast but steady, glancing over my shoulder at every bend in the trail, convinced that at any moment I'd hear the crash of undergrowth and the thunder of paws behind me. The trail climbed again, and I kept going until my lungs burned. When I finally reached higher ground and looked back, all I saw was stillness. The hollow was swallowed by trees and shadow, quiet as if nothing had happened. But my body still buzzed with adrenaline, my hands trembling as I unclipped my pack to take a drink. I didn't see another soul for the rest of that hike. I kept making noise on purpose, clapping now and then, dragging the tip of my trekking pole across rocks. Anything to remind whatever else might be out there that I wasn't sneaking up. The peace I'd felt earlier in the day was gone. Every sound in the brush made my head snap around. Every bird call seemed sharper. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was drained, not from the miles but from the tension. I sat in my car with the door open, staring at the woods, replaying it in my head. Two little cubs, soft and harmless on their own, but carrying a danger I can't even put into words. That was the closest I've ever come to real danger in the wild, and it wasn't from some freak accident or bad weather. It was from pure chance. A bend in the trail, a few seconds of bad timing, and I'd walked right into the most dangerous situation the forest can hand you. I was lucky. I never saw her, never felt her charge. But knowing she was there, knowing I had brushed against that line where survival becomes a matter of what an animal decides, that's what stayed with me. Now, every time I hike, especially in places where bears are known, I remind myself, it's not the big obvious dangers that will get you. It's the quiet moment when you round a corner and realize too late you're standing in the middle of something you can't control. Coming between a mother bear and her cubs isn't just dangerous, it's unimaginable. And the scariest part is you don't realize how close you are to it until it's already happening. It happened on a solo hike I took one summer, and to this day, I can still feel the cold dread that washed through me when I realized what kind of trouble I had wandered into. The trail was long and quiet, the kind of place where you don't see another person for hours at a time. I had set out early in the morning, wanting to make a loop that would take me along a ridgeline, drop me down into a valley, and then bring me back up through thick forest to where I'd parked. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, the kind of day where you feel strong just moving through the woods. The forest was dense on both sides of the path. Ferns grew tall in the shade, and here and there the trail cut through meadows of wildflowers where bees moved lazily between blooms. I wasn't rushing, just enjoying the rhythm of walking, the crunch of dirt and twigs under my boots, the sway of my pack with each step. For hours, it was peaceful, the kind of hike that makes you feel like you've put the world behind you. I had just started descending into a low area when I noticed movement up ahead. At first, I thought it was deer. Two small, dark shapes shifted between the ferns, their movements clumsy and awkward. I slowed, squinting through the trees, and then my stomach sank. They weren't deer, they were bear cubs. Both of them were about the size of large dogs, fur dark and glossy, noses buried in the dirt as they pawed and snuffled around. They were clearly young, but not tiny, old enough to be moving confidently on their own, still young enough to need their mother close. My first reaction was a kind of stunned fascination. I had never seen cubs this close in the wild before, but that fascination quickly gave way to something else, dread. Because there was no mother in sight. That was the problem. Two cubs and no mother meant one thing. She was nearby, and if I was seeing them on the trail in front of me, it meant there was a good chance I had just come between them. The realization hit like a punch. My whole body went rigid, and I felt my heart start to pound in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. The cubs hadn't noticed me yet. They were too busy with whatever they were sniffing out of the dirt. But it didn't matter. The second their mother decided I was a threat, she wouldn't care how still I was standing. Every piece of advice I'd ever read about bear encounters started flooding back in fragments. Don't run. Don't make sudden movements. Don't come between a mother and her cubs. That last one repeated over and over in my mind, like some cruel reminder of exactly what I had already done. I scanned the trees, every shadow and thicket suddenly alive with possibility. Where was she? Was she uphill behind me? Was she lower down the slope, waiting for her cubs to come back to her? Was she already watching me, muscles coiled, waiting to decide if I had crossed the line? The silence of the forest was suffocating. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my pulse hammering in my head. I slowly adjusted my pack straps, more out of nervous habit than anything, and forced myself to breathe evenly. My bear spray was clipped to the strap on my chest, within easy reach, but even the thought of moving my hand toward it made me hesitate. Any sudden motion could draw the cub's attention, and if they startled, she would come. I thought about backing up the trail, just easing my way out of the area, but the ground behind me was littered with dry twigs and leaves. One sharp snap under my boot could ruin everything. So I stood there, muscles locked, heart pounding, waiting. The cubs kept playing, completely unaware of me. One of them batted at the other, and they tumbled awkwardly into the brush, chuffing softly in the way young bears do. It should have been an adorable scene, something I would have been thrilled to witness under different circumstances. But all I could think about was their mother. The fact that she wasn't there was worse than if she had been in plain sight. At least then I'd know where she was, know what direction to keep my eyes on. A bead of sweat rolled down my back even though the air was cool in the shade. My legs started to ache from standing so stiffly. I forced myself to shift my weight slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound. My mouth was dry, and every time I swallowed it felt painfully loud. Minutes dragged by. The cubs finally moved deeper into the undergrowth, heading off the trail, their dark shapes weaving between the ferns. Relief washed over me, but only in small waves. Because if they were moving, it meant they were going back to her, which meant she was close, very close. I decided that was my chance. I eased one foot back, then another, moving as slowly as I could manage. Every step felt like an eternity. I kept my eyes on the trees, scanning for any sign of movement, ready to unclip the bear spray if I had to. The trail behind me stretched into shadows, each bend and dip looking like the perfect place for something massive to be waiting. I didn't dare turn my back fully. I just kept retreating inch by inch until finally I had put what felt like a safe distance between myself and where I'd seen the cubs. Even then, I didn't stop. I kept moving, slowly at first, then faster as the trail curved and climbed, putting elevation between me and the low area where the encounter had happened. My heart didn't slow down until I was standing on a ridge with a wide view of the forest below. Only then did I let out the breath I felt like I'd been holding for an hour. I never saw the mother, not once, but that was the part that has stayed with me the most. She was there. I know she was. She had to be. Whether hidden in the brush below or watching from somewhere higher, she was there the entire time. I had walked right into the most dangerous situation you can stumble into on a trail without realizing it until I was already in the middle of it. I hiked the rest of the loop with my nerves on edge, every crack of a twig behind me making me spin around. I sang under my breath for miles, not caring how ridiculous I sounded, just wanting to make sure anything out there knew I was human and not trying to sneak up on them. By the time I made it back to the trailhead, my body was wrung out, not from the miles I had hiked, but from the tension of those long minutes standing frozen with those cubs in front of me. I sat on the tailgate of my car for a long time, just staring into the woods, realizing how thin the line had been between a peaceful hike and a disaster I wouldn't have walked away from. That day taught me a lesson I'll never forget. The silence of the woods isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it means you've just walked into a situation where something wild is making a decision about whether you get to leave. And once you realize you've come between bear cubs and their mother, you understand just how small and powerless you really are out there. I was lucky. I never saw her and she never charged. But knowing she could have, at any moment, is a weight I still carry every time I step onto a trail. I've spent a lot of time on trails, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, and I've had my fair share of close calls. Most of the time it's small things. Snakes I didn't notice until the last second, slippery slopes that sent me down on my back, the odd strange person who gave off a vibe that made me want to keep moving faster. But nothing has ever put me on edge quite like running into bear cubs when I knew the mother had to be close. It was during a long solo hike, late spring, when everything was green and damp from recent rains. The ground was soft, almost sponge-like in places, and the air had that heavy smell of wet leaves and earth. I had been hiking for hours already, following a trail that climbed steadily along ridges and then dipped down into thick pockets of forest where sunlight barely made it through the canopy. My pack was heavy but balanced, the kind of load you don't notice much once you've adjusted to it. I wasn't thinking about danger. I never really did back then, not the way I should have. I had bear spray, sure, but I wasn't one of those people constantly scanning for wildlife. Mostly, I just let myself drift into the rhythm of my boots on dirt and the steady beat of my breathing. The first sign was the quiet. Up until then, I'd been hearing birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels in the brush. Then suddenly, nothing. The forest went silent in a way that made the back of my neck prickle. I slowed down, my steps softer, more deliberate. That's when I saw them. Two small shapes just ahead, right off the trail in a patch of ferns. At first, I thought they were dogs, maybe strays wandering around together. They weren't far off, maybe 15 feet away. Close enough that I could see the way they were moving, awkward and yet strong, clumsy in that way young animals always are. Their size threw me for a moment because they weren't tiny. They were right at the edge of being adults, bigger than I would have expected, but still clearly young. Bear cubs. The instant I realized, my stomach dropped. The rule drilled into me from countless hiking articles and warnings kicked in immediately. If there are cubs, there is a mother. And if the mother is around, she's probably already aware of me, even if I couldn't see her. I froze in place, heart pounding. The cubs hadn't noticed me yet. They were together, nosing around the underbrush, swatting at each other half-heartedly like siblings do. It should have been an adorable sight, but all I felt was dread. I didn't dare step closer, didn't dare run. Both options could spell disaster. I forced myself to breathe slowly and think. The silence of the forest pressed down on me. Every tree suddenly felt like a place she could be watching from, massive and unseen, waiting to defend her young. My hand brushed against the side pocket of my pack where the bear spray was tucked away, but I didn't want to reach for it too fast. That's when I remembered something I'd read once, about making yourself known without sounding aggressive. Singing, talking, even clapping, anything to show you're human and not a threat sneaking around. It felt ridiculous in that moment, but I pulled my phone out of my pocket, thumbed it on, and cranked the volume to full. A song started blaring, tinny through the little speaker, filling the still air with sound. I started singing along, loud and off-key, my voice shaking at first but growing steadier as I forced myself to keep going. The cubs immediately reacted. Their heads snapped up, ears twitching, eyes wide. They froze for a second, staring in my direction, and I thought my legs might give out from the tension of waiting to see what would happen next. Then, as quick as anything, they bolted. Both of them turned and tore into the brush, crashing through leaves and snapping twigs as they ran. The sound echoed down the slope, fading as they put distance between us. I never saw where they ended up, just flashes of their dark shapes darting between the trees until they disappeared completely. I didn't see the mother, not once. That was somehow worse than if she had appeared on the trail, because she had to be there. There's no way those cubs were alone, not at that size, not in that season. She had been close, watching, listening to everything. I kept my music going, kept singing loudly, turning in slow circles to scan the woods around me. Nothing moved. The forest stayed silent, except for the echo of my own voice and the song bouncing weakly out of my phone. I backed up the trail slowly, never turning my back fully on where the cubs had been. My mouth was dry, my chest tight, every step feeling like it might be the one that triggered a charge. I didn't stop moving until the trees began to thin and I could see more sky overhead. Even then, I forced myself to keep the music playing, my voice cracking from singing louder than I had in years. When I finally reached a higher ridge, I stopped and listened. The sounds of the forest had come back. Birds, insects, the occasional rustle of small animals. The silence had lifted. I leaned against a tree, my legs shaking, and let myself finally breathe in full. The rest of the hike felt different. I didn't drift into the rhythm anymore. I stayed sharp, hyper-aware, every sound making me turn my head. I kept my bear spray in my hand for miles, thumb hovering over the trigger. The memory of those cubs bolting into the bush stayed burned in my mind, paired with the unseen weight of their mother lurking just out of sight. By the time I made it back to my car at the trailhead, the sun was sinking and my body was buzzing with leftover adrenaline. I sat in the driver's seat with the door locked, staring out at the line of trees I had just walked out of. It hit me then how easily it could have gone wrong. If I had startled the cubs, if I had moved too fast, if their mother had decided I was too close, I wouldn't have had time to react. There would have been nothing between me and several 100 pounds of pure muscle and teeth. I don't think about most hikes years later. They blur together, green trails, long climbs, good views. But that day stays clear. The way the cubs looked, right at the edge of being grown but still small enough to need protection. The silence of the woods, like it was holding its breath. The knowledge that something massive and powerful was out there, close enough to end me in seconds, choosing not to. I walked away lucky. All I had to do was sing off-key and make myself loud enough to be left alone. But I'll never forget the feeling of being tolerated, of existing for a few tense minutes in the space where a wild animal decided I wasn't worth the fight. That awareness changes the way you move through the woods. It reminds you that you're not in control out there. Not really. You're just another creature passing through, hoping the ones who live there let you go in peace. I had been out hiking all day, and by the time I set up camp, I was exhausted. I found a spot tucked not too far from the trail, with a couple of juniper trees standing at the edge of a clearing. They gave some shelter from the wind and made the place feel a little more closed in. I got my tent pitched, set up my stove, and ate a quick meal before crawling inside with my headlamp. The sun had gone down long before, and the darkness out there felt heavier than usual. It was the kind of blackness that swallowed the land around me, where you could hear every sound but not see where it came from. Hours later, I woke up with the need to use the bathroom. I tried to ignore it at first, but the pressure grew until I knew I had no choice. It was cold outside the tent, and I didn't like the idea of stepping into that dark emptiness. But I grabbed my headlamp and made my way out. I decided to go near one of the juniper trees a little ways from camp. I had picked that area earlier in the day as my bathroom spot, far enough to feel sanitary but still close enough to find in the dark. The ground was uneven, with roots and dry needles scattered around, and the tree stood slightly apart from the others. I walked quietly through the cold night, the beam of my headlamp cutting a narrow path ahead. The air was sharp, and the silence pressed hard. All I could hear was my own boots on the dirt. As I approached the tree, I swept the light around out of habit, just checking the shadows. And that's when it happened. The beam of my lamp landed on something that made my stomach drop. A man was standing there, pressed close to the side of the juniper. His posture was strange at first, and then, as my light caught more detail, I realized exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just loitering or leaning. He was facing the tree with one hand braced against it, the other moving at his groin. He was masturbating in the dark, no more than a few yards from where I had planned to squat down. For a second, I froze. My body went rigid and the blood in my face drained so fast I felt dizzy. My first thought was disbelief. This couldn't be real, not here, not in the middle of nowhere. But the reality of it sank in quickly. The man wasn't supposed to be there. He had no reason to be near my camp. And the fact that he was doing something like that, in the dark, so close to where I slept, turned my insides cold. I didn't say anything. My instincts screamed at me to keep quiet. My heart pounded against my ribs as I slowly lowered the light, pretending almost like I hadn't seen him. I didn't want to draw more attention to myself, didn't want to provoke him, didn't want to know what he might do if he realized I had spotted him in the act. I backed away carefully, step by step, until the distance between us widened. My chest felt like it was caving in. Every sound of gravel crunching under my boots felt like it was echoing through the whole forest. When I finally got back to my tent, I slipped inside as quietly as possible, zipped the flap, and shut off my headlamp. Lying there in the dark, I couldn't calm down. My mind kept replaying the image of him beside the tree, the way his body looked in the beam, his hand moving in the cold night, his complete lack of awareness or maybe total disregard that someone else could be nearby. I thought about how exposed I was. A thin sheet of nylon was all that separated me from the outside. If he wanted to, he could walk right up and unzip my tent in seconds. I stayed awake for hours, ears straining for every sound. I thought I heard footsteps once, crunching slowly through the dirt, but I couldn't tell if it was real or if my fear was just amplifying the night noises. The air outside stayed still. Once in a while, a breeze rattled the dry branches, making me jolt. The need to relieve myself never left, but I held it in. The idea of stepping back out there was impossible. My only thought was making it until morning. The hours crawled. My body ached from the tension, every muscle tight as I lay in silence, clutching my sleeping bag around me and staring into the black. When the sky finally began to lighten, relief washed over me. I waited until the first full hints of dawn stretched across the clearing before unzipping my tent. My headlamp beam was no longer needed. The sun was rising, washing away the shadows. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. The juniper tree stood the same as before, quiet, rough bark catching the light. The ground around it looked disturbed, trampled maybe, but empty. There was no sign of the man. I packed up camp fast that morning. My hands shook as I stuffed my sleeping bag and collapsed the poles of my tent. I didn't even bother with breakfast. My only focus was to get back on the trail and put as much distance as possible between myself and that spot. Every sound along the way made me glance back, half expecting to see someone following, but the trail stayed empty. By the time I reached the parking lot, the lot was quiet except for one car I didn't recognize. I didn't know if it was his. I didn't linger to find out. I threw my gear in my vehicle and drove away, heart still racing, checking my rearview mirror every mile. That night stuck with me. It wasn't just the shock of what I saw. It was the fear that came with it. Out there, miles from anyone else, you're vulnerable. A stranger showing up in the middle of the night is bad enough, but catching one doing something like that makes it worse. It isn't normal and it isn't harmless. It felt threatening, even if no words were spoken, even if no moves were made toward me. It was a reminder that not all dangers on the trail come from wild animals or weather. Sometimes it's other people. I never camped near that spot again. I found myself choosing sites further from the trail, hidden deeper, harder to stumble across. And every time I stepped out of my tent at night with my headlamp, I thought about that juniper tree. I thought about the beam of light landing on him, the shock in my chest, and the cold realization that I wasn't alone in the dark. It made me more cautious. It made me realize that when you're out there, even a quiet clearing in the woods can hide something you'll never be ready to see. And once you do, you can never look at the silence of the night the same way again. I was used to being outside on trails after work. Walking or hiking home had always been something I liked. It was quiet, peaceful, and gave me time to think. Most days I got off around 7 in the evening, and that meant I had just enough light left to make the walk without feeling like I was alone in the middle of nowhere. The air still carried the warmth of the day, and I would sometimes hear kids laughing in the distance or dogs barking from nearby houses. It never felt dangerous. That changed one night when I worked late. I covered a half shift and didn't leave until nearly 11. By then, the entire atmosphere of the trail had shifted. The shortcut behind the train tracks that felt harmless in daylight now looked like a place I shouldn't have been. The shadows from the trees stretched across the dirt, and the few streetlights nearby did nothing to cut into the dark. It was the kind of blackness that swallowed up sound, where even my own footsteps seemed muted. Still, I kept walking. It was habit, and I told myself it would be fine. I had taken this route dozens of times, and it was always the same trail. But about halfway down, I came across something that froze me in place. There was a bike propped neatly on its kickstand at the edge of the path, and beside it was a man lying on the ground. He was moaning, but the sound didn't feel real. It wasn't the groaning of someone truly hurt. It was exaggerated, almost rehearsed, like when a child fakes being sick to get out of school. It made the hair on my arms stand up. I looked at the scene closer. The bike wasn't wrecked, no scratches, no bent wheel. It had been placed upright with care. That was wrong. If he had fallen, if he had crashed, the bike wouldn't be standing so perfectly. My mind immediately clicked into overdrive. Something wasn't adding up. My chest tightened, and the longer I stood there, the more wrong it all felt. I decided not to go near him. I angled away and started toward the incline that would take me back up toward the tracks and then to the street. My steps quickened as I told myself to just get out of there. And that's when I heard the shuffling, gravel crunching, faster this time. The moaning stopped, and instead there was the sound of someone springing up and moving quickly. The change was instant and violent. He had been pretending. The sudden rush of noise behind me lit my nerves on fire. I pushed myself harder up the slope, lungs burning, legs pumping, sweat breaking across my forehead even though the night air was cool. The incline seemed endless, each step heavier than the last. I could hear him behind me, the rattle of the bike chain, the scrape of rubber on dirt, closing in. Just as I got to the tracks, the sound behind me reached a frantic pitch. Then came a metallic smack and the violent crash of someone hitting the ground hard. I didn't turn at first, too focused on getting to the safety of the street. But when I finally looked back, I saw the bike twisted on its side, its front wheel bent against the steel rail. The man lay sprawled a few feet ahead of it, groaning in a way that sounded real this time, sharp and pained. I stood there, chest heaving, and realized what had just happened. He had tried to chase me down and failed. The adrenaline coursing through me was still strong, but underneath it was another thought that hit just as hard. If he had caught me, I didn't know what would have happened. He hadn't been armed, at least not from what I saw, but he had chased me with intent. That was enough. I kept walking, faster now, until I reached the glow of a gas station nearby. The sight of its buzzing fluorescent lights was like a lifeline. I stepped inside, shaking, and used the payphone to call the police. I told them what happened, the details about the bike, the fake moaning, the chase, and the crash. When the officers showed up, they seemed less surprised than I expected. One of them told me the man was known around town, someone who pulled stunts like that to rob people. He had done it before, pretending to be hurt until someone got close enough to let their guard down. Sometimes he got lucky, but often it ended badly for him. They said it wasn't the first time they'd had to scrape him off the ground after he went over his handlebars trying to pull something like this. The officer brushed it off like it was nothing serious. But for me, standing there still sweating, it was more than a funny story. The man had chased me down with the clear intention of doing harm, and the only reason he didn't succeed was because he tripped himself up. I couldn't shake the thought of what might happen if the next person he tried it on wasn't able to outrun him. Someone smaller, slower, or less cautious might stop to help, and by the time they realized the danger, it would be too late. I went home that night shaken but safe. I never took that trail again after dark. Even in daylight, it carried a different weight, as if the shadows of that night still lingered in the gravel and trees. The shortcut wasn't worth the risk anymore. I started walking along the main road again, with traffic and headlights and people around. Felt safer even if it was longer and noisier. I hoped, as I thought about it later, that the fall that night might slow him down, at least for a while. Maybe the crash had injured him badly enough to stop him from trying again. Hopefully before he victimized a weaker person, before he picked someone who couldn't run, or someone who was too kind to keep walking when they heard a fake moan in the dark. Because not everyone gets lucky. Not everyone has a train track waiting to trip him up. And that thought has never really left me.